second as soon as our late arrival, Gary, sits down.
I can get him a chair.
So yeah, let's get this rolling. This is a special event for me because my daughter Ann from Minneapolis is joining us because she wanted to see if I could actually do this in front of a crowd that's half the size of what it started at before we sent out an email this morning. And I do want to thank you for coming to these uncharted waters of the COVID and Elk Rapids, or at least the uncharted indoor air, to hear from, and anytime I or Ken write about Heather, mention her name in any of our publications, we always say our favorite biologist, our favorite fisheries biologist. And you saw what it did. You know, we got 6-year commitment of brown trout, but they seem to have gone somewhere else. We don't know. And hopefully, I think she is going to address that tonight. Heather, just by way of background, is the DNR's top fisheries biologist for a area that covers much of the northwestern Lower Peninsula, extending east and west from 75 to the Wisconsin borders on Lake Michigan, and south to north from roughly Cadillac, maybe a little north, to the Mackinac Bridge. Her region is home to many of Michigan's top fishing lakes and streams, thousands of riparians like yourselves, and even more anglers. They all want her to help them do what they want to do. They want to catch more fish, they want to catch bigger fish. To say that she has a tough job is an understatement. No surprise, Heather is a Michigan native. She grew up in Kent City, just northeast of Grand Rapids. She earned her BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Management from Lake Superior State College, went on to the University in Nebraska, which I think the only fish it's really known for is paddlefish and walleye, to get her fisheries MS. And no surprise, she's married to a fisherman, one of the top fishing guides over in Benzie County, right? And yes, she personally, when she's not doing biology things and looking at data, and actually being out on Elk Lake and helping pull the snapping turtles out of the nets, which we watched last summer. She loves to fish and hunt. Turkeys a lot.
A lot of turkeys.
Yeah. It's ironic that the last time she joined us for a short thing was in a recorded Zoom in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Here, you know, our numbers are deflated a bit, but they're going to go through the roof as people go to our YouTube page. Michael's going to make that magic happen. We would like you to hold your questions. We know you're eager to ask where those brown trout have gone until she finishes her presentation. So let's give her a big ESLA welcome.
Well, thank you guys. I certainly appreciate everyone that came out tonight. I did leave, there's plenty of time for questions. And I know what I'm gonna cover for the most part tonight is what we did in the 2022 survey, kind of explain what it is we were looking for and how we did that. But after that, I know there's a lot of issues in the watershed and a lot of different questions. So once I get through this, I am open to any questions. Thank you, Bob, for that very nice introduction. So we're gonna jump right in here. So in Fisheries Division, the only way for us to really kind of understand what's going on in a body of water is to really get in there, set a bunch of nets, spend some time, and try to cover a lake the best we can so that we're getting at a little bit of everything. We started surveying Elk Lake sometime in the 1950s. I'm only kind of covering some modern stuff here, but we have a lengthy history of doing work in the chain of lakes, on Elk Lake in particular. And so I think roughly over time, we've done around 20 different surveys and a variety of different types of surveys. So we have done surveys like in 2005, 6, and 8, we did a targeted survey looking at rainbow trout. So we stocked rainbow trout in Elk Lake for a number of years, pretty much all through the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. Survival, we really didn't know. Like, we got some reports from people that were catching fish and other reports from people that said, man, I don't know where these things are going, but they're not here. So what we did during that time frame was we did a paired comparison. So we stocked Michigan strain steelhead and Eagle Lake strain rainbow trout. And in those 3 years, we came in, we set nets, we did some electrofishing, we marked fish. When the fish were stocked, they had a unique fin clip. So the steelhead, say, had a right pectoral fin clipped off, and the Eagle Lake strain had a left pectoral fin clipped off, so that when we, or you guys as anglers, recaptured them, we could clearly ID which species they were. In most lakes, what we saw was that steelhead performed better, which is great news, except our hatchery system, we only have 6 fish hatcheries in the state of Michigan, and everybody and their brother wants steelhead, whether it's an inland lake or a river or the Great Lakes. So we are maxed out at steelhead rearing capacity. So despite the fact that we know they perform better, we don't have enough space to rear more, which is a problem. The bigger problem here in Elk Lake was that neither one of them survived very well. You find a few here, you find a few there. Statistically, there was not much of a difference in who survived better, at least according to our netting survey. And then in 2009, we actually did a creel survey. And some of you may have encountered that person. They drove around the lake in a boat and pulled up next to you, talked about your fishing trip, asked some questions, that sort of thing. So based on that information, we cut the rainbow trout planting, and that was the last thing we stocked for a little bit of time, up until we started the brown trout program a few years ago. From 2009 to 2016, a few of you may remember that Jory Jonas and the crew from the Charlevoix Research Station were working on a remnant lake trout strain study on Elk Lake. So they were in the lake. I got to help with that a few times. They were in the lake those few years, gill netting, doing short set gill nets for a couple hours at a time. We didn't kill any fish, and tagging lake trout, and then having you guys recapture them and give us some critical information. So that was going on in that time frame. And then 2022, I'm trying to get back around to a lot of the lakes that are bigger, more heavily fished, more popular in the sense that people are interested in what's going on these lakes. We cover such a big area that, and my unit has more water than any other unit in the state. So we can get into these bigger lakes roughly every 10 to 15 years, which isn't ideal. Ideally, I'd like it every 5 to 10 years, but I'm gonna take what we can get right now. So the last time that we were in here to do a what we call a status and trend survey was 2008. So we were well beyond due to get in there and do another one. When I say status and trend survey, what that means is we have a standardized protocol methods that we use on these lakes when we do a survey. And what that allows us to do is that allows me to look at the data that we collected in Elk Lake and compare it to other lakes. Whether it's Torch Lake, whether it's Portage Lake in UP, Houghton Lake, I can look at growth rates, I can look at fish species composition, and I can make statewide comparisons. And so a lot of our researchers will use that data to perform some comparative analyses and things like that. When we did that survey in 2008, and you'll see once I get into the data a little bit, there are some notable differences that actually allowed the 2022 survey to work out a whole lot better. Fish stocking. So, fish stocking actually has a lengthier history than our history of conducting surveys. So the first fish that were stocked in Elk Lake were stocked in 1890. It's 10,000 Atlantic salmon. Through the late 1800s, early 1900s, we stocked a few other things. We stocked lake trout a couple of different years. We stocked walleye. We stocked some largemouth bass. And then through the 1930s and 40s, kind of in that era of post-World War II, especially when things like the Civilian Conservation Corps and hatcheries were being built in order to get people back into the workforce, we stocked a lot of fish. All over Michigan, we stocked a pile of fish. And so in the 1930s and 40s, it was a mix of yellow perch, some more largemouth bass, a few smallmouth, lake trout, walleye. So that kind of went on intermittently. We got away from those kind of cool water, warm water fish in the 1970s, and from the 1970s to about 2008, we stocked a mix of cold water fish. So lake trout, brown trout, rainbow trout, different strains, different sizes, that sort of thing, trying to find something that worked. And for a long time, the lake trout obviously worked, brown trout worked for a long time. Rainbows they had some years where they were very good and had some years where they didn't perform so well. We also had an accidental steelhead stocking in 2018. So one of our hatchery drivers was pretty new and a little confused on the directions. And so instead of stocking on this side of the road, he stocked on that side of the road. So all the steelhead that were clipped and tagged and ready to go to Lake Michigan ended up in Elk Lake. And I have had a few people report catching those fish in Elk, Skegemog, and Torch. More of them in Torch. So more of them in Torch, then Elk, and then just one out of Skegemog. So those fish we did have some survivors, which I would expect. And then like I said, we've been stocking brown trout since 2018 to present. Initially, that was a 6-year kind of pilot program. And one thing to keep in mind when we stock brown trout, we stock them 1 year. By that following fall, you may catch some, but I don't really expect you to encounter any until the fall after that. So there's a little bit of lag time. And so, you kind of want to look at it at face value and be like, man, we've been stocking these things for 6 years. We're not really seeing anything. What's going on? I'm not super worked up about it yet because we've got to give those fish a little bit of time to be in the system. I think they're doing some other things, and so we have plans to kind of look at that. What we were going to try to do this year is we were going to give those fish a fin clip before we stocked them out, so that when you guys or any of the guides that encounter them see that, they can call me, drop me an email, and let me know what you got. I have a sneaking suspicion. Well, there's one or two things that are happening. We're either A, not getting very good survival, completely plausible, or B, those fish are moving throughout the chain, probably to Torch. We don't really know. So clipping those fish and being able to rely on you guys to kind of help us, and we would come in and do some survey work too, but to kind of give us some of that information, anecdotal information, would help us kind of see what's going on. I don't mind if they're going to Torch. I mean, they've got fins. They're going to swim. And prime example, we stock Atlantics and Torch. I've had more reports of Atlantics being caught in elk this year than I have. I mean, I've been here since 2009. And I've heard of more Atlantics being caught in elk this year than I have ever. So fish swim, fish move. They're doing something. We just don't know what they're doing. I'm not just going to cut that stocking off at 6 years and be like, oh, didn't work, we're done. Sorry, Elk Lake. Even if they're not surviving, they're providing a food source. Somebody out there is eating them. If they are surviving, they're going somewhere. People catch a lot of brown trout in Elk Lake, so maybe or in Torch Lake, so maybe they're contributing there. I'm not just going to give up on it. We still need to figure out what they're doing. If it is that they're not recruiting, they're not surviving, then maybe we talk about doing something else, The other thing that I'm going to do for next year is we've been stocking a mixture of 2 strains. We had very high hopes for our Sturgeon River strain of brown trout. And this would have been, we thought, in theory, a perfect situation for those brown trout. Our Sturgeon River strain of brown trout come from the Black Lake chain. And so they spend a lot of time in the Black River, but they also have access to all those larger lakes in that chain and other river systems. So they're highly migratory. And so when you've got a system much like this, it's interconnected, just like the Black Lake chain, we thought there was some similarity there and that those would be a good fit. So the other thing we can do is I can get rid of those sturgeon rivers and go back to stocking wild rose. Wild rose is a historic strain that we typically use, and so we know from angler reports and from surveys in the 80s and 90s, those fish did do well in here. And it could be something else too, right? There could be some changes in the lake that are simply lending to it not being suitable. I doubt that. Things have certainly changed. Don't get me wrong. Things in those lakes have definitely changed, but we're still supporting wild populations of browns, lake trout, and rainbows. So there is still habitat suitability there for them. There's the forage in these lakes is amazing. Between juvenile cisco and white suckers, shiner species, minnow species, I'm not worried about bait fish populations when it comes to supporting predators. So hopefully we were going to clip those fish this year, and it just so happened our steelhead run was exceptionally early. My crew runs the Little Manistee Weir, and we fin clip fish at the hatchery. So when the two happened at the same time, one's got to be given up, and unfortunately it was the fin clipping because steelhead egg take is a little bit more high priority project. So I'm hoping to get together a different crew to come in and have a backup plan in case that overlap happens again, because I'd really like to get these fish clipped in 2024 and 2025 so that we can kind of see what's going on. So what did we do while we were out here throwing nets around in so we were out here for a week. There's two components to these kinds of surveys. So the first one is we were out here for a week using a bunch of netting gear. And so following that status and trends protocol, and I threw a couple extra nets in there just for good measure. The Great Lakes gill nets are not status and trend protocol, but Jory and the Charlevoix crew they've used those historically here to get at those lake trout. So the first couple days of the survey was Eric Chrisman and the boat crew coming down, and we divided the lake into 3 sections. And they started from north and worked to the south, and they set one of those experimental gill nets overnight, moved it the next day, moved it the next day. So that was the first portion of the survey. We then came in a few days later and set the rest of the gear. And so we had 1 small mesh spike net, 2 experimental gills, and 3 large mesh spike nets in each of the 3 sections of the lake. And we moved those around every day. Took the lake, and I made it into a big grid map, and then we would randomly select shoreline stations, or if it's a gill net, offshore stations, to put those nets. And the goal there is to, by moving them around every day, we're capturing every habitat type. And sometimes we always have backup sites. Sometimes you get to a site that's just not suitable to set that type of gear. We try to keep it as random as we can, so there's no bias in the sampling, but we also want to make sure we're covering as many different types of habitat as we possibly can. So those nets were all in there for a week. We set them on Monday. We would come and we would lift them every morning, sort through all the fish, collect all the information that we needed. Usually it's a length and an aging structure, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and those fish go back. We did, in the gill nets, you do unfortunately end up killing a few fish. Try not to, and that's partially why we're in here so early in the year, because it's a big, cold lake, and we're trying to get a little bit of everything, right? Like I want to see panfish, I want to see bass, I wanted to see trout and salmon. So getting in there early in the year, you get away from the warm, harsh temperatures that have a tendency to kill fish. You don't catch a lot of any one thing, but you catch a lot of things. So that to me is a more valuable survey, looking at the big picture. Maybe I didn't catch as many brown trout or as many Atlantics as I wanted, but I caught those, and I caught a bunch of other species that we were unsure of at the time. Then we come back in, typically when it's a little bit warmer, typically about a month later, and we do an electrofishing and seining survey. So seining is just what it is. It's a beach seine, so you've got 2 people on the net. One person is parked on shore, and the other person walks in a big circle. We use those to get at those forage species that I was talking about. So minnows, shiners, juvenile fish, things that we can't get in this bigger gear, that's what we're looking for with those. And then the electrofishing, we've got a vessel that has a generator on board, and that vessel's got 2 booms off of it. It's got a bunch of ground wires hanging off the side. The generator generates pulse DC 220 current. And so the cathodes off those booms send that electrical field into the water. We create this big field around the boat, basically. And so it's around the entire boat, and it goes, we can successfully shock about 8 feet of water at the most. So we go around the shoreline, we randomly selected shoreline sections, cruise along the shoreline, and there's 2 of us on the front of the boat, furiously netting everything we could possibly find. And that's a really good way to get at big fish and small fish. So using all those gear types combined, we can cover all the different size ranges of fish, different species of fish. There's a lot of fish that, not a lot of fish, but sometimes fish are a little bit shy of the gear, especially when you've got super clear water like we do here. So combining all those efforts together gets us a really good snapshot of what the fish community looks like. So what did that look like? This next slide's a lot, and I do apologize for that, but. So, that's everything we caught. So we caught 30 different species, and a lot of them. Rock bass, man, 4,200 rock bass. That was a lot. But what this survey did was it did exactly what I wanted it to. So, brown trout, we only caught 19 of them. And a lot of them, over half, were the fish that we had stocked a few months prior. Some of them were holdover adults we had stocked in years past or were wild. So would I have liked to have caught more brown trout? I definitely would have. But if we'd have caught more brown trout, we probably would not have caught 150 smallmouth bass or the 6 random walleye. So there's a little bit of trade-off in trying to do a really good job of capturing the bigger picture of the lake. And when I talked earlier about we've been doing surveys in Elk Lake since the 1950s. When you go back and you look at our files, some of those were like targeted whitefish surveys or targeted Cisco surveys, or they were looking specifically at lake trout, which is good information, but it doesn't give you kind of this big picture overview. This did not disappoint me in any way. I was very happy to see, there's a pretty robust diversity in forage species. So creek chubs, white suckers, the 2 darter species we have there, spot-tail shiner, sand shiner. The slimy sculpin we caught him, we had one small mesh, it was a small mesh spike net set off one of the creek mouths. So he's a straggler out of the creek, but we'll take him. The 9-sign stickleback, the mimic shiners, the log perch, those are all species that the fish that we all like to catch, and so many times we come into these lakes and do surveys and everybody just wants to see what's going on with the game fish, right? Like what's going on with the trout, what's going on with the walleye. But what I really need to know is what's going on with the little fish that they eat. Because I can't manage for what you guys want to catch if those fish aren't there, or if there's an issue with the diversity of that sort of thing. So I was very, very happy with these survey results. It was a little on the cold side, so we didn't see a ton of largemouth. Walleye are another one. So we do stock walleye throughout the chain, Bel Air in the lower. So, and I've been talking with a couple of the charter guys this summer, and they're seeing a lot of walleye moving through the system. And that's walleye. It's part of the walleye life history is as they age, they like to move downstream. So you stock them in a lake for a while, and they kind of start to age, and they want to kind of move out. So most of the fish that these guys have been catching are older fish. They're kind of on the tail end of things. They're not unhealthy, but it's a lot of head, less body. You can just tell they're an older age fish, and they're kind of working their way through the system. Jim Chamberlain's caught. Man, the last time I talked to him, I don't know, he was averaging like 1 a day there for a while. So he's been seeing far more of those in the past year than normal, if you will. But we've been stocking Bel Air. Walleye stocking was inconsistent for a long time. We've been consistent for about 10 years now. And so I suspect that's why those fish are kind of moving around a little more. So how does this compare to what we've seen in the past? Like I mentioned, so we try to do these status and trend surveys so that they're comparable. Sometime between 2008 and 2012, we changed the protocol of the status and trend surveys. And so when we came in here the first time, we used trap nets, which this is not a lake where trap nets are going to fish very well. Trap nets, you need kind of a nice, gradual, kind of perfect drop-off. And so the lack of drop-offs, or super steep drop-offs, they don't fish very well. But fight nets do. So fight nets are much easier and more effective gear type to use in this lake. We also did not use small mesh spike nets in 2008. And so when you look at those survey results, there's very few small fish. There's very few minnows, very few shiners. Again, kind of getting back at that forage. We just didn't see it in 2008 because we didn't use the right gear to actually get at it. So in 2008, we saw 13 species. Like I mentioned this year, or last year, we saw 30. 2008, we caught 812 individuals. And we crushed that with almost 6,200. That was a lot of fish to work through, but definitely worth it. We did the surveys in the same time frame, so it was the same week. I try to do that every time we get into a lake that we've been in before. So again, catch rates, weather patterns are certainly shifting, but in theory, catch rates should kind of mimic each other if we do them in the same time frame. So like I mentioned, the gear, there's a lot of differences in the catch, but the gear certainly accounts for that. The changes that we made in the gear, we used more gear this time around. You know, the net list was pretty extensive. I think we used about half that the last time. So even if you cut the effort we had this past year in half, we still did loads better than we did in 2008. And in 2012, we saw more Atlantic salmon, brown trout, and even lake trout in the catch than we did in 2008. They did use the Great Lakes gill nets in 2008 and the experimentals. So those I can kind of compare at face value. And when you look at those, we definitely did better in 2012 or 2022 than 2008. So, are the fish healthy? Good news is, so we were in here in the spring, and a lot of times you will see fish diseases pop up in the spring. There's a lot of transition. Fish are stressed out because it's the time of year that most of them spawn or have just gotten done spawning. You've got pretty drastic weather changes. We see a lot of wind, we see temperature fluctuations, we see the lake rolling over and stratifying. So in their world, spring is a really kind of stressful time frame. So any kind of viral or bacterial diseases typically present themselves in the spring and then in the summer when it's really, really hot. So of all the fish that we handled, we did not see any fish that looked like they had any issues. No cold water disease, no wounding, no external infections, anything along those lines. I kind of talked a little bit about sometimes we incidentally kill fish in those gill nets. Those fish go to good use because we turn around and in the status and trend lakes, we will send X amount of those fish off to Eagle or DEQ's lab. They process those fish and give the results to the Department of Community Health. And that's what those Eat Safe Fish guidelines are developed from. So DNR does not establish those Eat Safe Fish guidelines, but we are the ones that are providing the data towards it. And for anybody that's ever wondered, those are edible portions of fish. So everybody wants, sometimes you'll hear folks say, oh, they just grind everything. Not the case. When we give them fish for that type of sampling, in that lab, they're taking those fish, they're filleting them out, and that fillet is the process sample. So it's not all the belly fat, it's not spinal tissue, it's not any of that stuff. And with that testing, no news is good news. So because we don't establish those guidelines, I don't often see that data, but if there's an issue, they call us. And if there's not an issue, they don't call us. So we had no lines of communications from the Department of Community Health that any of the fish that we sent in from elk had any issues. We sent smallmouth bass. We sent smallmouth bass and yellow perch. It's hard because you have to have a good sample size for them, and you don't want to sacrifice a ton of fish. So we kind of had to play in the bounds of what fish did we have the most of in those gill nets that were deceased. So those were the two, which actually works out really well. Sometimes we end up sending them white suckers. There's not a lot of people that eat white suckers. There are a lot of people that eat yellow perch and smallmouth bass. So for me, that's a better informed sample if those are the kinds of fish that we're sending, are fish that people are actually going to consume. So I talked about what we do with those fish once we catch them. So we lift a net, we put those fish on board the boat. We're taking a length off of all of those fish. So we're identifying them as species, we're taking a length measurement, and then on game fish, we're taking an aging structure. And for what we do, that's typically either scales or spines. So we will either cut or we will scrape like a nickel-sized patch of scales off of a fish, and they regenerate. So fish scales regenerate. If you handle a fish and you scrape those scales off, that fish is going to grow new ones. So we take those off. Spines, we do the same thing. It depends on the fish, but we flip either, it's usually dorsal or anal. We'll take like the first 3 spines off of that fin. And what we do with the scales, all aging structures with fish are like trees. They all have rings called annuli. So every year that fish grows, during its growing cycle, it's laying down calcium that creates a ring. And then in the wintertime, when growth slows down, you get an expansion. So you can very clearly, just like a tree, you can very clearly see those rings. So with the scales, what we do is we take those, we dry them, we put them on a sheet of acetate, which is just kind of a hard plastic. We run them through a jeweler press, which will make an impression of that scale on the plastic. You can in turn take that piece of plastic, look at it under a microfiche, and count those rings. Scales can get a little tricky because if that fish is older and it's shed a bunch of scales for whatever reason, those regenerative scales aren't as old as the fish, right? So if that fish is 5 when it loses its scales, that new scale is going to be really cloudy and weird. So a lot of times that older fish will take the spines. Same thing, you cut them into a cross section. You can burn the face of them, or you can just put a little mineral oil on top of them, polish them, and look at them under a microscope and see those rings there too. So that's how we age fish, and that's why it takes a long time for us to kind of get these results. My crew goes and goes and goes and goes and goes all summer. And like I said, we manage weirs, so we're spawning salmon in the fall. Come December, my guys all sit down and start entering all this data that we collected all summer. All 5 or 6 lakes, all 25 streams, whatever we did. And then they start working through these fish aging structures. So we may do a survey in June, but it's probably February or March before I have all the data in hand and can actually review it collectively. The only bummer with this data was I cannot compare growth rates very well. So statistically, pesky math, right? Statistically, you need 10 fish out of each inch class to come up with a cumulative average. And so one thing we did really well here was we caught good numbers of fish, and we caught a variety of sizes of fish. But a lot of the species, we didn't catch enough of one particular size to statistically develop an average. So in 2008, we only had 3 species. In 2022, we only had 3 species. None of them were the same. So it makes it kind of hard for me to compare. But if you look at those, it is a little bit, I don't know, kind of disappointing, right? So lake trout are growing at 0.8 inches below state average. Cisco, 1.4 inches. Rock bass were growing above state average. No shock there, that's what they do. Brown trout, and with 1.2 inches below average. Smallmouth, 1.2 below. Yellow perch, 1.3. I don't like it, but it's not the end of the world. Especially when you look at what's going on in Elk Lake, what type of lake it is. Most of the time we see high growth fish in very productive lakes, very eutrophic lakes. Lakes that are very organic, that have a lot of productivity coming through the system. So you may not have as many fish, but the growth rates tend to be a little bit better. That's not what Elk Lake is, right? So we're not that productive. So thinking about that situation, those growth rates are pretty on par. Cisco, I don't like. I think I like the set of everything. We have good bug populations. We don't really know too much about plankton and zooplankton populations, but that's probably where the issue is. Same thing for yellow perch. I would say for yellow perch, when we think about invasive species coming into a lake, yellow perch are the ones that seem to be across the boards the most negatively affected, especially when you think about like zebra and quagga mussels and their filtering power for taking nutrients out of the lake. one point in time, we estimated that in Lake Michigan, zebra and quagga mussels had about 80 to 90% of the lake's available biomass locked up on the bottom in the form of their decaying shells. And so we've seen a noticeable decline in the amount of plankton. The lower trophic level of these lakes has significantly declined. We see issues with bait fish out here. We see issues with yellow perch. Inland lakes that have those invasives are not free of that issue. And so these fish that in their early stages really rely on zooplankton and plankton as a critical component, those things like cisco, things like yellow perch, they have struggled over the past 20 years competing with those invasive species. I jumped ahead of myself, so I talked about this a little bit already. So right now we stock, I take whatever's available. So we stock between 30 and 40,000 brown trout in Elk Lake every year. We are potentially talking about maybe splitting those fish up and stocking them at a couple of different locations. Currently we stock them at the south end of the township park, the township boat launch. Like I said, so that's on the table. Changing strains is on the table, and then getting those fish clipped for 2024 so that I can rely on some of you folks to help me monitor that is also on the table. For that, want to jump in?
Yeah, I think we're.
And I've got business cards up here in the front with all my contact information on them. So, if you want to call and yell at me or call and ask questions, whatever, grab one of those before you take off.
Those of you who read the email blast that went out this morning know, Ken Krentz, who was supposed to be up here doing this instead of me, did feel healthy enough to send along a few questions that he was going to ask. And I will use MC privilege to ask you to hold your questions a little bit longer and go over a few of these. I also wanted to give a shout out to two fishing guides. Jim Chamberlain has been mentioned a number of times. He's a very good fisherman. I've been out with him a couple of times, and he really focuses on elk and torch and does quite well, especially if you like to troll. I'm not crazy about trolling, but he is very productive. The other one is Fred Fields, whose primary interest is smallmouth. He tends to fish Skegemog and elk in the early season. He releases every fish he catches, and then he fishes the bay a lot in the summer. So, first question that we've alluded to a couple of times, if you want to elaborate any more on the brown trout and where they might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're moving around. I think survival isn't necessarily top notch, but I think more than anything, I think they're moving around. Where they're going is the main question. And then from that, do we want to change anything? So, kind of what I'm stuck with is they're working somewhere, right? It's not necessarily where I'm putting them. So then the question is, well, why are they going over there? And if we change where we stock them, are they going to be as successful? Is there something in their pattern of movement that's allowing them to be successful? Why are they choosing that? So once we know, it's kind of a Pandora's box. Once we know if that's the case, if those fish are surviving okay, but moving, then we kind of need to game that, because the intent of the stocking program was to create a fishery for you guys, not necessarily torch, but it's working in torch. So do we keep doing what we're doing and add something else? Do we cut it and move those fish to torch? What's the direction we go after that? So we need to get those fish clipped. We need need to enlist you guys' help to help us figure out where those fish are going, and then we can kind of start putting the pieces to the puzzle together and pick a direction to go.
Yeah, that's a really important point that you need to get feedback from the people who are fishing on these lakes, and what's the best way for people to do that?
Just drop me an email. You know, if you're, and I realize not everybody's here full time, so maybe you're up for a week here or a weekend or whatever. I don't care if you do it every time you go fishing. I don't care if you do it once a month. I don't care if you're the kind of guy that keeps a log and then sends me a photocopy at the end of the season. Or just pertinent information if you don't want me telling all your secrets, which I try not to do. I don't write the fishing reports, so I don't give out everybody's honey holes. But just drop me an email and let me know what you're seeing. Fred does that a lot. Jim does that a lot. We've got another guy on Torch, Sean Rokenbeck, who does that a lot. Jim's, and I've known Jim for a long time, so he Facebook messages me and says, hey, you know, this is what I'm seeing in stomach contents this week, or, you know, this is a pattern that I've seen kind of change. What do you think? So that helps. I can't be here every day. I cover parts of 9 counties, and I've got beautiful water, but it's a lot. And so I rely very heavily on you guys that are on these bodies of water every day to help keep me informed. And so just drop me an email. Just drop me an email.
Another question. In the last year or two, we have confirmed gobies that you talked a little bit about, and as well as quagga mussels. We knew we'd have zebra mussels for a long time, but last year we identified a pile of quaggas on the north end of the lake off the golf course. Some of you who fish often and fish bottom habitat may occasionally pull up some weeds that have quaggas on them. So what do you think about the impact of those two species?
So, of all the invasive species, gobies are my favorite, which sounds like a weird thing to say. But the problem with invasives is we don't know anything about them, right? So we don't know how they're going to fit into any of our ecosystems. We don't know what kind of niche they're going to carve out for themselves. What are they going to out-compete? Are they going to prey on anything that's native and critical? How are they going to interact? And so there was a lot of concern about gobies when they first showed up. And those concerns were super valid. But gobies have actually worked out to be a better thing than we anticipated. Everything likes to eat them. Smallmouth bass, brown trout, lake trout, steelhead, walleye, northern pike. When they're small, we've seen them in the stomach contents of bigger perch, panfish, rock bass. So there are native species that are utilizing them. They are still a problem in the respect that they take up resources that should normally be available for native species. They do a little bit of nest predation with fish like smallmouth and fish like yellow perch. Most of the studies that have come out of that have shown that it's not as bad as we anticipated, but it's still a factor. So I've had reports of gobies in here for a while. Not in any great numbers, but somebody might catch one in a minnow trap, or someone might find them in stomach contents of brown trout, that sort of thing. We did catch some gobies in the survey. They were not young fish, they were older fish. So they've been in here for a bit. And as long as they stay at a relatively low level, they'll probably fit into the niche okay. Like I said, they're certainly utilizing resources from native fish that we'd rather see utilizing it. But on the flip side, they're creating a food source for those same species. The draceniid mussels, on the other hand, are the worst. They're my least favorite. And like I mentioned, the issue with the zebra and the quagga mussels is their capability to filter water so fast and to use up so much of the nutrient resource that's in any body of water. We're to the point that we've had them long enough. I mean, we've had draceniid mussels since the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So like out here, we're to the point where they have now they've got more food availability, and they're gonna capitalize on it. So we've got lakes that are kind of late to the party getting these invasives because we've done a good job with boat wash stations, because lakes and lake associations have been really cognizant of it. So the lakes they had them right away have kind of mimicked Lake Michigan, where they've kind of peaked off and they're just kind of in maintenance status, if you will. We have a number of these lakes that are kind of the second wave, where we did this great job of trying to keep them out. Somebody slipped through the door, and so now they've become established. And the difference between the two, zebra mussels prefer a little bit shallower water than the quagga mussels do. And so unfortunately, since we have deep water and shallow water, and by deep water I mean plus 200, like that's really kind of where the quaggas really like it, is out in that deeper 200 plus kind of zone. So there's a lot of inland lakes that don't have quaggas just because they don't have suitable habitat. Lucky you, you guys do. So unfortunately we're seeing those for the first time these past couple of years, and I'm hoping they will run their course quickly and stabilize, but we just don't. It depends on food availability, so we don't really know.
A question about tournaments, particularly bass tournaments, and obviously from the bass fisherman,
Yep.
Fred. The reason that we have fish seasons in Michigan generally is to protect spawning fish. The bass season in Michigan opens earlier.
Technically never ends.
Bass are still spawning well into June.
Yeah.
And a lot of the tournaments choose that time to be out here. And we've had reports of where fish are supposed to be released live, where they're released half dead after being in a live well half a day. What's your thoughts on that?
So, this is an issue that I have been working on quite a bit. I actually happen to be the co-chair of the Black Bass Committee for Fish Division. So, I spent a ton of time working in Grand Traverse Bay and Waugoshance and the Beaver Island Archipelago, looking at bass movements, helping tag fish, looking at spawning timing, that kind of thing. We have a whole different regulation out of the archipelago. It's a July 1 harvest opener. And that regulation has been in place for 25 years now, roughly. And what we've seen happen out there is that population looks vastly different than the population here or the population in Waugoshance. Now, mind you, all of those populations integrate. We get tag returns. Fish that were tagged in the archipelago get caught here. Fish that were tagged here get caught in Waugoshance or Green Bay. Like, there's isolated populations around Lake Michigan, but they move around. Again, fish swim, who knew? So, when we changed that harvest regulation out there, what we saw happen was we saw that the size structure and the age structure open up drastically. And what I mean by that is, you see older age fish, and you see larger fish. So we have better growth rates, and we have older age fish, more year classes that are available to spawn, thus more fish that are being produced. We have talked about using that regulation in other bodies of water. Most of my waters, like you mentioned, those bass are not done spawning when the harvest season opens. Sometimes they're not done spawning until the 4th of July. So we're not giving them great protection. The bass fishing industry really pushed on us for a catch and immediate release season. So technically, you can target bass all year round in Michigan. That is certainly, in my opinion, put some stress on those populations too. Tournament fishing has really blown up too. And I fished bass tournaments as a kid. You know, my dad fished the BASS circuit. Like, I get how all that stuff works, and I can appreciate it. Don't get me wrong. But I think there's some practices that we can work with those tournament guys to do to improve the success of their releases. Bass tournaments are required to register in the state of Michigan. We've, in the past couple of years, seen a bunch of small tournaments pop up that aren't being registered. Bass guys love bass. Like, they 100% care about bass. But I think you've got a faction of folks out there who are kind of new to the tournament thing. And so I think there's some things, we're talking about it internally about some try with some of our regular tournament directors, as far as like where they release fish, how fish are being handled, temperatures, that kind of thing, and just being more cognizant of how we handle bass. So that's kind of where we're at, is we're having that discussion. We're gonna have that discussion with these guys this winter and see if we can't come up with some options, because we heard a lot of complaints about bass tournaments this year, which, you know, isn't the greatest, but we don't want to take that opportunity away from folks, but we want to help the issue, so.
Questions from the audience?
Okay. Yes, sir.
So survivability depends on the size you're stocking. What size are you stocking, and is that an issue?
So I don't feel like it is. We've been stocking pretty big size brown trout. 5.5 to 6.5 inches on average. We can't get them any bigger. So with brown trout, we used to stock brown trout at around 4.5 to 5.5 inches. A number of years ago, we actually did a photo period manipulation where we changed the amount of daylight that we give the adult broodstock in the hatchery to get them to spawn earlier, so that we can get a couple months more growth. And so doing that, we've been able to, and actually we've pushed fish close to 7 inches. We're putting out the biggest brown trout now that we've ever really been able to. So size definitely does play a factor. Stocking location plays a factor. What your predators are doing play a factor. So it all plays a factor. But at this point in time, I'm pretty happy with the size of brown trout that we're getting. We get most of our fish, typically we get them from the Odin hatchery. Sometimes we get them from Henrietta. Typically, I like the Odin fish a little bit better because they tend to be a little bit bigger. But Henrietta's catching up in that too. So, but I've been really happy with the quality and size of brown trout that we have been getting. Yes, in the back.
You learn anything about muskies?
What would you like to know about muskies?
You didn't get any.
Well, hopefully we're gonna get some here pretty soon. So,
Who said that?
so to kind of catch you up on muskie stockings, we have not historically stocked the antrim chain. It's a naturally reproducing fishery. It's very popular. And we didn't stock it because all we had available for a very long time was northern strain muskie. And that's not what we have over there. We have Great Lakes strain muskie. Those are fish that at one point in time, before that structure over there was built, had access to this water behind us. And so they're in there because they were part of a naturally transient population. So there's some importance there in maintaining genetics and maintaining the appropriate strain. Wolf Lake Hatchery down by Matawan, Kalamazoo, is the only facility that we've got that does muskie. And we've been very slowly building our Great Lakes strain muskie program down there. We are finally to the point where we have, and we stock, there's two kinds of muskie lakes. You've got broodstock lakes, where we're trying to establish a population that we can go into and take eggs from. And then you've got kind of just recreational lakes, which is where we fall. We are finally to the point where we are successfully rearing big enough, happy enough muskie at Wolf Lake that we can start stocking lakes other than our broodstock lakes. So for this year, the 2 lakes that we have in the chain that are going to move forward, if we have enough fish, are Skegemog and Intermediate. And then next year, we have a standing prescription for Bel Air, and then I'm looking at one more potentially, so that we get 2 lakes in the chain stocked either every other year, every 3rd year, that sort of thing. It won't be super high level, but it will be enough to hopefully help our wild stocks of fish build themselves back up again. Super popular fishery. We've done some stuff with size limits to kind of help preserve them a little bit, help protect them a little bit. We have pretty high growth rates on our muskie in the chain. And now we just need to help them, we need to give them a little jump start to help with numbers. So that's kind of where we're at for muskie going forward this fall. So we've got enough muskie in the hatchery this fall to stock out, I think the end of September, maybe early October. For our unit, Skegemog is the number 2 priority. And it looks like each unit's gonna get at least a few of the top priorities stocked this year. So Fingers crossed we'll get some for Skeg.
What kind of number is it?
Skegemog. The stocking prescription for Skegemog calls for 2,200 fish. Yeah. And they're, I don't know what the size looks like this year, but they should be plus 10 inches. Should be. So that's why it's a little bit lower number. Yes?
Down south, they had problems with netting muskies for these surveys, and especially the Great Lakes stream seem to be pretty smart fish.
Yep.
They don't like that.
They do not.
That would not be unexpected.
No. No, and that is a very common thing with muskies and trying to sample them. Net avoidance is a huge thing. We oftentimes have more success electrofishing them, but electrofishing can be tricky on big fish. They don't respond quite as well. So muskie are kind of one of those fish that they are a tough one to kind of get a hold of. So as far as assessing them, again, that kind of like angler reports really help. Even if you're just like putzing around the south side of Clam, or you're putzing down the Torch River, if you see a couple, just shoot me a note. You know, even those kind of reports, you know, I've got reports like that through the years, you know, and if I go back and look in 2010, 11, 12, my reports, it was, you know, people were seeing 5 or 6, and all of a sudden in 2030, people are seeing 20. Even though that's anecdotal, it certainly helps me. So even observances is good information. Yes.
Maybe a weird question, but I don't know what electrofishing is. It stun them?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Let me explain that better. Yep. So I kind of described the boat, but what that does is so it stuns the fish and kind of paralyzes them for a brief second. It interferes with the signals that are being sent down their dorsolateral line. Yes. Not as harsh though. So those fish will momentarily kind of roll on their belly and start to float up to the surface, just quickly enough for us to scoop them up. And then we'll put them on a tank in the boat if we're doing a boat survey. And typically by the time they're in that tank for 10 or 15 seconds, they're flopping around and they're back up and running.
You mentioned about early on, we take or top 8 water or 8-foot water.
Yep.
So you know, like below that, you're not seeing.
Yes. So we typically try to we're only doing shoreline surveys with the electrofishing equipment if we're on a lake. And there's different types of electrofishing equipment. We use it in streams and small rivers too. Boats and backpack units, that kind of thing. With the boats that we use in a lake, the field surrounds the boat. So the boat's roughly 20 feet and the field kind of extends around the boat out another 6 or 8 feet, depending on conductivity in the lake. And so we try to stay, like 6 feet of water is a really good zone to be in because you can catch fish on the outside, you can catch fish on the inside. And we're really looking for those fish that are kind of working drop-offs. That's a very popular feeding mechanism for fish in the heat because we do this at night. And so it's easier to see them in the water. And so following those shoreline contours and drop-offs is more productive because A, our equipment gets it, and B, because that's where those fish are tending to feed in the evening. So
Go back to like an elk, 6-8 foot, that's very small.
it is. Yep. So, but that's why we use the netting gear too. The gill nets we can set. Well, for instance, with Jory's lake trout survey, I mean, we were setting those gill nets on the bottom in 200 plus feet of water. So that type of gear we can fish effectively pretty deep. But with the electrofishing gear, it's definitely a shallow water game. Yes.
You talked about lifting being a problem because you had 2 things happening
Yeah.
at the same time. Do they use volunteers and all for that?
So we do. It's not the most fun deal. So those fish are roughly that big. You're using a tiny pair of scissors, and it's cold, and you're outdoors, and so we will use volunteers. But we've got to have some of us from the crew around to help the process and help with counting and all that kind of stuff. So that is an option. We had some volunteers lined up to work with us this year too, but steelhead spawning this year, we did it 5. So normally with steelhead spawning, it's over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks, usually 3 weeks. You'll spawn a day here, you'll spawn a day there, you'll spawn a day here. You capture kind of the whole run. All our fish came in at once this year. And so we had a marathon fish spawning session. We started on Friday and went till Tuesday, worked all weekend. and knocked it out like that. So it was kind of the worst case scenario of all hands on deck, kind of crisis level sort of deal. So you're going to plan far more accordingly for next year.
ESPA does quite a bit of sampling of DO and sinking depth and that type of stuff. Give us a handle. What do you think of our biological health of our lake, from your perspective?
Overall, I think we're pretty good. I think we are seeing some changes. But all of our lakes are. And so when I look at kind of what you guys are seeing here versus other lakes, it's very similar. We're seeing things pop up in lakes we really haven't seen them before, whether it's algae, whether it's invasives, whether it's plant die-offs, that sort of thing. I've got a lot of lakes that have not huge issues, but little things that are changing. And I don't think you guys deviate much from that. So I mostly concentrate on the fish end of things. I look at what you guys do kind of supplementally, and I look at sometimes to kind of like, why did we not catch this then? Then I may look at your temperature profile or something and be like, oh, well, that was a little warm. So I'm using it as supplemental information. I focus more on what the fish community looks like and then try to find answers that way. But looking at the fish community and what's living in the lake and where it's living and how it's feeding, I think you guys are in pretty good shape. Like I said, I was very, very happy with what we saw for forage fish, for bait fish, and that is really kind of the canary in the coal mine. As a manager, I can only manage from the top down. But in nature, the incidences and the issues tend to come from the bottom up. And so you've got to find kind of that way to meet in the middle. And so, based on what we saw, I'm generally pretty happy with where Elk Lake is at. Yes.
Two things.
Okay.
One, on ground trout, for example, you're looking for, there hasn't been a big die-off. I mean, they're not on the shores. So something's happening, that they're either in some bigger fish's belly, or they've gone somewhere.
Yep.
But the second thing I want to talk about, when you did your whole survey on elk, you didn't catch one rainbow.
No.
And, for years, that was a very popular fish out there. And there was times when I was staying in touch with you and stuff. What we were catching were ones that were spawning.
Yeah.
There, they were not the planted ones.
Nope.
And so what's happened that they've stopped? Certainly there isn't the pressure of fishing on them.
No. Well,
Not anymore.
no, not in the lake. Not in the lake. And it's funny because, everything is kind of tied together. So we know that the rapid contributes fish to the population. We haven't really seen, I still get very good reports from the rapid. When we go in and survey it, we're still seeing good numbers of young fish. I don't really know where, and we're still seeing not as good, but decent numbers of rainbows being caught in torch. So I'm not sure. And part of me kind of wonders if there's just something going on. We've had that conversation about rainbows. Now we're not sure what the browns are doing. So what's the common denominator there?
Hold on, we're at a high level.
Right.
I'm watching these fishermen go out here with planer boards.
Yep.
And they're not pulling anything up, so they're either going after brown or rainbow.
Right.
They're not getting
They're not catching them. I know. And and we've seen. So one thing, I was talking with somebody the other day about the number of small perch we're seeing on elk. And it's interesting because then when I talk to some of these guys that fish regularly that are catching some browns, rainbows, and Atlantics, they're seeing a lot of small perch and stomach contents. So I talked a little bit about the fact that perch numbers have been on the decline because we have lower level trophic issues because of presented mussels. So if larval perch or young perch are what's in the most abundance, is that the bottleneck that's not allowing those brown trout or rainbow to be successful? is the fact that we've seen declines in yellow perch. I mean, it shouldn't be, right? Because there's tons of other forage, but is that the one that they're hyper-focused on? And so in their absence, is that why we're not seeing those upper level fish?
Or is the aquagus eating the plankton that the trout?
Right, yeah, so are we,
Because it hasn't affected the bass.
right. So are we losing those fish at the very young stage when plankton is still a very critical component of their diet? So that's kind of the game of what if. So is it here? Is it here? You know, what's the silver bullet? What's the one thing that's going on out there that's negatively affecting them? And so I feel like we've got 2 or 3 really robust young year classes of perch. It'll be interesting to see if we see an uptick in trout numbers. I don't know, but when there are young perch around, we see them very heavily in the stomach contents in inland lakes. So is the decline in perch potentially what's driving the decline in trout? Could be. Could be part of it.
Just 2 more questions.
Okay. Yes.
When we first moved to Elk Lake 20-some years ago, on the shore, shallow water, you had tons of freshwater clams, as they call them, and crayfish under every rock. Can't find them anymore. Is that a zebra mussel effect?
Most likely. We did see a good number of crayfish in the survey, especially when we were electrofishing. Electrofishing is a really cool tool because even if you can't catch stuff, you can still see stuff. Because it's at night and the boat's lit up like a spaceship. And crayfish, because they're a crustacean, you don't shock them. But they sense something's going on, and so they move. And so you can very readily see them on the bottom. And Ken and I had talked about the decline in crayfish too for a number of years, so I was pleasantly surprised to see how many crayfish we saw. Granted, a lot of them were rusties, but we did see some native species too. When it comes to native mussels, what a zebra mussel or a quagga mussel will do is they will oftentimes use that native as a host. So they will adhere to their shell and live on top of them and essentially smother them out. So a lot of these lakes, my counterpart, who's the biologist out of Cadillac, has been working on Lakes Cadillac and Mitchell. He snorkels and collects native mussels and counts the number of zebra mussels on them and then picks them off, try to help the little buggers make it. But that is a very real issue that we've seen in inland lakes where those dracenid mussels are essentially suffocating out native species. And so I would suspect that has certainly partially led to their decline. Also food availability, but same thing, ties back into the mussels. The other thing that mussels do is they force a lot of native species to change their behavior. So if you're a native clam, or if you're another small species of fish, a darter, you've got kind of a preferred habitat that you want to live in. And if the zebra mussels have eaten all the food out of it, or if they've taken it over, well, now you've got to go find somewhere else to live. And so sometimes fish and critters are successful at that, and their patterns simply change. So where you might have always caught them for 20 years, they're not there, not because they're gone, because something else has forced them into a different habitat. The other problem is sometimes when they go to that other habitat, it's not the right habitat. And so you end up seeing species declines or number declines because they no longer have the right habitat because they're being outcompeted. Yes, Bob?
Did you do any stomach analysis on the fish?
We did not, but I've got a handful of guys on the lake that regularly do. But we didn't do any gastric lavage or keep any stomachs or anything. But so along those lines, since we're kind of out of time, grab a card. I'll put some more out. Anytime you have questions, I'm out in the field a ton of in the summer, so kind of bear with me. But just drop me a note. I will happily answer. Call me. Let me know what you're seeing. Like I said, you guys are kind of the eyes in the field, and that helps me tremendously. So thank you guys for allowing me to come chat and ramble about Elk Lake.